Unit called Unity and Diversity, Unit 9. We're going to be looking at different means of supporting the theory of evolution. The first means of supporting that theory is the fossil record. The fossil record is a catalog of every fossil that we are finding as we find it, right? So scientists are constantly cataloging fossils that might be found on construction sites whenever you're having to disrupt deep soil, right? Or after mudslides, or all kinds of disruptions that may occur in a landform, which now reveals something that from millions of years ago, okay? So fossils can include different bone structures. Sometimes we get artifacts, but we can catalog those based on where they're found in the soil. We also have carbon dating. There's different means of helping us understand how old those fossils are. The fossil record's really cool because it helps us understand what things used to look like, right? We can put their bone structure together. Sometimes they're fossilized in form, so we're able to see what those organisms look like and get an idea of what life on Earth used to be. And then we can draw conclusions about what the environment was like based on the shape and structure, or the structure and form of the organisms that lived on Earth at that period, right? So this right here is an example of the fossil record, and a word that you guys need to know that is not written on here is called law of superposition. Law of superposition. So if you guys will write that down. Position. Law of superposition. Once you guys have that written down, what you want to do is consider the oldest rocks are in the deepest layers of the earth, generally. There are exceptions because of earthquakes, because of different shifts in landforms. And then the most modern fossils are in the top layers of the landforms. Clayton, put your chair on all fours. You'll notice another thing about the law of superposition is these oldest fossils are very simple in contrast to more modern fossils. Life forms generally become more diverse and more complex as life on Earth continues to change and evolve. Okay, speaking of evolution, we've talked about how life forms have come from different molecules that have bonded together to perform specific functions, which we call the characteristics of life, right? Like reproduction, using energy, right? So those first life forms were prokaryotic cells. So that's whenever different molecules finally started, in personification words, collaborating to perform specific functions. We still have prokaryotic life forms on Earth today. Some of the most familiar ones are bacteria, right? Everybody knows about bacteria. We've talked about the human's body having more bacteria cells than actual human cells, which is pretty astounding. So you can imagine how tiny these structures are. They're very simple. They reproduce asexually, not sexually, right? So they can divide through oftentimes binary fission. So prokaryotic cells were the more simple forms of life, which is where things would have started from, and then eventually evolved into more membrane-bound organelles in the cell, having more complexity as they got more functions. So they evolved over many, many, many years. We're talking millions of years to get slightly more adapted to their environments. And that would have changed through genetic mishaps, right? So sometimes happy little accidents, is that Bob Ross's phrase, where those cells would have had some kind of difference in when they were reproducing that would have been advantageous, and then that affected the entire population because that cell is able to survive in its environment successfully and pass on that genetic difference that led to maybe mitochondria, ribosomes, or other advantageous organelles. Eventually you get eukaryotic cells, and we know that all multicellular organisms are made of eukaryotic cells. We are eukaryotic organisms. Here's an example of a fossil imprint. Fossils can show us kind of what we've talked about already, what has existed here before. We can also get an idea of how those transitional species might have changed over time. Thinking about whales coming from an animal that may have even walked on land, which is pretty wild, right? How do we know that? Because they still have hind leg and hip structures inside their body that are totally useless today. So why do they have them? They're remnants from an older ancestral species that it could have evolved from. Does that make sense? Are y'all cool? Kind of weird. We're going to be seeing lots of different pictures to support this. This is just a really fast overview. Before we go on any further, will y'all please go to page 2 in your student notes, answer the question about the law of superposition there. If you said that mammals are the youngest, please explain why you think so, based on its position. All right, guys, a moment ago we were talking about how these changes occur because different features are advantageous in their environments, right? As environments change, what is that the traits that are advantageous also may change, okay? So the faster the change, the more radical these traits might evolve, because if you were adapted for a completely snowy and white environment, and then within just 50, 60, 70 years, that snowy, cold, white environment is now land or grass, all of those earlier features, then you're going to stand out. Those white species are going to be picked off by predators. They're no longer able to adapt. So the traits that are advantageous are the animals that blend in more. Does that make sense? So we'll be talking about natural selection soon. With that said, though, one of the questions on your test is going to ask you about the Don horse. Okay? So when we look at these, really you're comparing all these transitional species. So remember, I know that 1,000,000 years is really hard to conceive, but the Roman Empire was 2,000 years ago. How many more thousands of years would we have needed to reach 1,000,000 years ago? Just 1,000,000. And now we're talking about 50 million years ago is where this particular story of the Don horse is where we're jumping into it. So look at the shape of this earlier horse species here. You can see it's got, what is this, 4 finger-like structures for its feet. You can see its teeth have heavy enamel, which may indicate the kind of food that it's eating. So the heavier the enamel, the more durable the teeth are, right? Then you've got some changes in the skull size. Look at how the head is becoming larger. The hooves are changing. Now we've got one of the protrusions, the finger-like protrusions, are retreating in this species. Different species, right? We can see that there's probably a connection based on the comparative anatomy analysis that we're doing, but it is a different species. Now we're looking even further, and you see the feet protrusions, those finger-like protrusions are retreating even further. We've now got one very distinct, what's going to become a hoof. We have more layers. So we've got enamel, and now we've got even more durable teeth happening here. And then finally, we're getting close to the modern day horse with a hoof instead of like a foot on the ground. It's got hooves on the ground. We've got different teeth structures happening here. Very different skull size. So looking at that as a whole picture again, from the dawn horse to the modern horse, you'll be analyzing what similarities and differences you see so that you can kind of, when you're placing things, although you'll get to see the level of earth that it's in, so you can get a general idea of its age through geologic time, you can also use carbon dating to help you get a general idea of its age. But multiple species could be living at the same time, right? So that's not a perfect process. You can also use, okay, where, if I've got this modern horse, it obviously did not fit between the Hyracotherium and the Mesohippus. Like, this looks like a closer transition than from here to here to here. Does that make sense? These transitional species, you can see that slow evolution over millions of years. Okay? So now we've got evolution through the process of natural selection. This again was talking about how like maybe environment changed. So if the environment is equally detrimental or equally, you might have same parents passing on different traits. For example, your blonde hair to your brunette hair, right? We're the same species, have slightly different physical appearances, right? Those are alleles. So these alleles may be advantageous or harmful. If these same bugs are making their home, their habitat, against dark brown wood, well then the brown bugs are going to have the greater advantage, right? We're going to be looking at the peppered moth phenomena to where the environment changed drastically because of air pollutants that were causing the trees to become black. So these once white moths, there was white and black moths, same species, but the white moths no longer had an advantage because they would stand out against the trees that used to be birch trees, like in Minecraft, that where they would blend in, right? But now they're covered in soot, like ash, and they don't blend in anymore. So those are the variety that got picked off, and you see that population changing because the ones that are able to survive reproduce. So the colors that are most advantageous, or the shape or structures that are most advantageous, get passed on to the next generation, and then over time change the entire population. Okay. Sometimes those genes lay dormant for a very long time. So it's pretty cool when we see anomalies. Two different types of evolution, microevolution and macroevolution. A lot of people are very comfortable with microevolution because we can see how similar like a coyote and a dog and a wolf are, right? But macroevolution sometimes makes people feel uncomfortable. So you've got, or it's harder to get your head wrapped around because it's hard for us to conceptualize $1 billion, right? Let alone 1 billion years, right? When the oldest thing that's in our kind of modern framework in our societies today, a lot of people are rooted in like Judeo-Christian text, which helps us paint a really clear picture of what life was like 2,000 years ago, right? So that's kind of the oldest thing that we really spend a long time studying and becoming familiar with. That's only 2,000 years though. So now we're having to stretch our brains to think about, okay, what's millions of years ago? What's billions of years ago? How might life have changed? And that's really hard to get our heads wrapped around. So thinking about life changing from those single-celled organisms to multicellular sea organisms, right? And then we're starting to get these transitional species from the sea into land. And then finally, land-dominant species, right? This obviously is not a perfect chart of transitional species. Okay, we talked about gradualism, where change happens over remember all this is a very quick overview, but gradualism is when change is happening over very long periods of time with relatively slow environmental changes, resulting in relatively slow and evenly paced adaptations and then evolutions. But sometimes those environmental pressures change quickly, causing either gaps or very distinctly different features in a shorter amount of time. So we've got punctuated equilibrium. So very little change, and then all of a sudden rapid change. You can kind of see how landforms might be very different because of that rapid change, leading to less diversity. Whereas gradual change, you're going to see lots of different diversity and organisms, lots of organisms in the fossil record there. So evolutionary relationships is when we're looking at those similarities like we did with the horse. Now we're looking at the different types of dog relatives, analyzing the different shapes, seeing those similarities, and how they might have evolved simultaneously, but in different ways for different environments, different prey. Okay, I think that there's a page called, what page is the wing on? Is it page 3? Okay. Take a close look at the images on page 3 in your student notes. There's 3 words that you'll need to write somewhere on your page. Homologous structures means that it has the same shape but different function. For example, a bat's wing has very similar shape. There's indications of a common ancestor between a bat and a human because of the shape of our hands and the shape of the bat's wings. But obviously we don't use our hands to fly, and bats don't use their wings to eat apples, to grasp onto things in the same way that humans do. So homologous structure means, in short, same shape, different function. Analogous structures, are you ready for this one? Liam, give me the thumbs up when you're ready. Analogous structures means same function, different structure. I would write down butterfly wings and birds' wings. We know that they have the same function, right? They both allow those creatures to fly. But boy, a bird's wings are very different in structure than a butterfly's wings that doesn't even have bones, right? Butterfly doesn't have feathers. The shape of the wing, the hinge point of the wing, very different. So again, analogous structures are same function, different structure. Now, vestigial structures are kind of interesting because they are leftovers. Vestigial structures, I would write down tailbone, okay? So humans have a tailbone, which is a remnant structure from our evolutionary ancestors that would have needed a tail for balance, for grasping onto things, signaling. We obviously don't have tails anymore, but we do have vertebrae. Some of us have 2, I think up to 5 vertebrae in our tailbone, which are just remnant structures. Now we have muscles attached to them. That's the same thing as the whale hind legs. Obviously, we don't have whales that are going to be crawling up on the beaches successfully. Their legs are no longer even protrusions in their body that they can manipulate. They're vestigial structures, leftovers from their land walking ancestors. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to just answer that question right there on page 3. Show me a thumbs up whenever you have answered that question. Okay. Which one of those words apply to the bat wing and the whale fin? If you put down homologous structure, you are correct. Homologous structures, so same shape, different function, right? A bat's wing is not going to help it swim, and a whale's fin is not going to help it fly, but they have the same shape, different function. Now, when we look at those analogous structures like birds and insects both have wings, the organisms are structurally very different and not closely related. So the more similar the structures, the more closely related generally they are. Okay? Even if they have the same function, unless the structures are similar, they are probably not closely related. Wings of birds and bats are structured similarly. So they have the same function and they have similar structures. So they are more closely related than, say, insects and birds. So bats and birds, it makes sense to be more closely related. Limbs of horses and zebras are structurally similar. They are more closely related than birds and insects. And you can see that they're probably even more closely related than birds and bats because they're much more similar. Vestigial structures could be human tailbones as an example of a vestigial structure, or whales' hind legs. Guys, in this one we have a phylogenetic tree, and it's helping to organize organisms by their anatomical similarities. So I'm going to teach you how to read this because you have a couple different exercises, some together and some independently, where you'll have to use this cladogram, this phylogenetic tree. So the thing that all of these structures have in common is vertebrae. So all of these organisms are all vertebrates. Okay? Now, a jawless fish does not have a jaw. The organisms that do have jaws start here. Cartilaginous fish all the way to birds. All of these organisms have that in common. But do you see how this red line indicates anything before that does not have this feature in common? Y'all, I think that you have to create one of these in this unit. So if you're having a hard time focusing because we've been talking for a long time, make sure you're paying attention now, okay? Bony skeleton, the thing that separates all of these organisms from bony fish all the way to birds is that they are made of bones, right? Cartilaginous fish do not have true bones. So that's why they do not get included in this part of the phylogenetic tree. And then finally, we get 4 limbs and lungs happening here. So the amphibians all the way to birds have 4 limbs and lungs. And then amniotic eggs, which is one of the features that helped organisms move from sea life to land, is the amniotic egg. So being able to survive out of the water. All of these creatures have. And then hair is unique. So do you see how this is a branch now? So all of these creatures have all of these things in common, but this creature has a separate branch right here, hair. So the mammals have hair, whereas turtles, lizards, snakes, crocodiles, and birds do not.
Wait, so Mr. Shuffler, you have 2 animals, and here it says for like the worm, if that's a worm, it'll be like a human if it was the jawless fish. It would be a human, and then it would be a mammal. Wait, how would that?
That's right. So if you had a picture of a human here, it would you would wait and put that human picture. This could have another branch like the snakes and lizards here. You could have another branch here that said humans if you wanted to include this in that diagram, because they have all of these things to be true and they have hair like mammals. So do you see how that branch would work? Great question. Good analysis. Mm-hmm.
So some paleontologists say that there's this type of dinosaur called a Dimetrodon, and the Dimetrodon, it wasn't actually classified as a dinosaur or any sort of reptilian because it was warm-blooded, yet it looked like a Komodo dragon with a sail on its back, and the sail was used to they would angle the sail at the sun and it would absorb heat so that it would warm up the body, but it was warm-blooded. So what classification would that be?
That's really interesting and tough. So these transitional species might have features. For example, have you guys ever gotten, what do you call them, goosebumps? right? So, or even our ears. I was watching a video this weekend to where you know how some of us are able to move our ears pretty freely. That would be a feature from when our ancestors had ears that could move to detect predators, incoming predators. Do we have that feature today? No, but we still have remnant features. We still have remnant muscles that allow us to get some small movement in our ear, even though it doesn't really help enhance our audio at all. So in the same way, that organism might have had remnant vestigial structure that no longer serves the same need, right, warming its body, as perhaps its cold-blooded ancestors. So, yeah, I'm going to pause there. Does that kind of make sense? So the idea that there's leftover structures that don't serve the same function, because if it's warm-blooded, it's going to maintain homeostasis through metabolism in a way that its cold-blooded counterparts would need to use external environmental features, capturing the sun's heat, basking on a rock, a warm rock, that kind of thing.
Yeah, because in future evolution, the Dimetrodon, it was closely related to another species of mammal in the Cenozoic period that I cannot remember the name of, but it did not have the sail at all. The sail like slowly just absorbed back and
Okay, thanks for sharing that, Madison. Please, you guys, like, something about dinosaurs are captivating, so please chime in with any of that extra knowledge that will help us all grow together. It's pretty cool. Harrison?
So, when you study fossils, normally when you draw the fossils, you shrink them because of the fossils. A lot of people don't add fat to the things because I've seen images of hippos, and the process is called shrink wrap.
Yeah.
I've seen images of hippos, but they look super skinny because they're shrink wrapped.
Right. So you're saying that
There's a chance they might not look like that.
trying to represent fossils in the modern era is hard because some tissues are soft tissues that don't preserve as successfully as those hard tissues, right? So those minerals aren't able to seep in with that slowed decay of the hard tissue. So we can't factor in things like fat storage. So we get totally wrong images of what we're looking at.
It's like trying to remember what a building looks like, but the only thing you have is just the metal frame.
Oh, that's a really good analogy. Alrighty, guys. So our last thing that we're going to be talking about, so far, just to recap, we've got fossil record as one form of evidence for evolution, the theory of evolution. Remember, theory, guys, again, is widely accepted as truth among the scientific community because of the ample amount of evidence that we have to support that. Of course, like anything in science, the more evidence that you have, the more discoveries that we have, the more our perspective has to shift, right? So perspectives shift and theories change to accommodate new evidence. Does that make sense? All right, so the last thing we've talked about, fossil records, comparative anatomy, looking at those transitional species. And finally, we're looking at the embryological development. Embryo is before you are born, right? Before we exist on our own independently. That's what we mean with embryos. So embryonic development proceeds in a parallel fashion. Mammals and fish are more closely related than they appear based on our adult features. Remember, we're talking about embryos before we are fully formed into adults. I want to show you guys a picture really quickly. Okay, this is back to natural selection. Let me look at you guys with this embryological development. There's not a great photo in the slideshows, so I'm going to quickly switch over. Let me see your student notes to see if it's got a photo of embryological development. And it doesn't. So some of the things that we find, I'll kind of talk you through this, and in future lessons you'll get to see lots of pictures of it. But some of the things we find in embryological development is like gills. our embryos have gills dating back to our very long time ago ancestors' need for gills. All of us end up having prominent tails as embryos, dating back to when our species needed tails to survive, right? So those embryologic forms are very, very similar to where, in fact, whenever I show you the pictures, I am unable to tell which one is human, which one is chicken, which one is mouse, which one is frog, right? They're very different adult species, right? Hopefully don't look anything like a frog in my adult form, but my embryo did look like a frog's embryo. Does that make sense? So you'll start looking at those similarities. I think natural selection, this is a really good image for natural selection here. So looking at that population change again. So we've got variety. As populations become very abundant, you start getting more and more pressures on that population, and traits, advantageous traits, are able to succeed, whereas less advantageous traits are less able to succeed based on the resources available. So you can see in the selection image 3, a lot of the what are these mooses are dying, and you'll see that the tan or creamy looking mooses have less population to pass on to the next generation, causing a population shift toward dark furred mooses. We already kind of looked at this example. Yeah. All right, guys, and that